Imagine a battlefield where 6,000 men face 30,000. The fate of an entire nation hangs in the balance. Blood, strategy, and courage will determine whether Portugal remains independent or is swallowed by its neighbors. This is the story of the Battle of Aljubarrota, one of the greatest military feats in Portuguese history. Picture this. The year is 1385. The summer heat beats down on armored men as they prepare for what will become a legendary confrontation. On one side stands the Portuguese forces, outnumbered but fighting for their very existence. On the other, the mighty Castilian army, confident in their overwhelming numbers and certain of victory. In the 14th century, Portugal was plunged into a succession crisis, following the death of King Ferdinand I. Without direct heirs, the throne was contested between John, Master of Aviz, and the King of Castile, who claimed the Portuguese crown through marriage. The entire future of Portugal as an independent kingdom hung by a thread. On August 14, 1385, these two armies met at Aljubarrota in a confrontation that would forever change the course of history. What happened on that fateful day would not only determine Portugal's independence, but would set the stage for its future as a global maritime power. Did you know that the battlefield tactics used at Aljubarrota were so innovative that they're still studied in military academies today? Or that the alliance formed during this conflict between Portugal and England remains the oldest diplomatic alliance still in force in the world? The events at Aljubarrota weren't just about clashing swords and flying arrows. They were about identity, survival, and the birth of a nation. This wasn't merely a battle. It was Portugal's defining moment. If you love history and want to unravel the mysteries of great empires, like this video, subscribe to the Medieval Archives and don't miss a single episode. Join us as we journey back to that scorching August day and discover how, against all odds, a small nation stood firm against an empire and changed the course of European history forever. When King Ferdinand I of Portugal drew his final breath in October 1383, he left behind more than just a vacant throne. He plunged Portugal into a perilous political crisis that threatened the very existence of the nation. The king had no male heirs, only a daughter named Beatrice, who was married to none other than John I of Castile, Portugal's powerful neighbor. The Castilian king wasted no time. With marriage ties to the Portuguese royal family, he immediately laid claim to Portugal's throne. This was the nightmare scenario many Portuguese had feared: absorption into Castile and the end of Portuguese independence after nearly 2.5 centuries as a sovereign kingdom. But the Portuguese people weren't ready to surrender their identity. They rallied behind an unlikely hero, John, master of the military order of Aviz. Born as the illegitimate son of former King Peter I, John was a half-brother to the deceased King Ferdinand. Though not the obvious heir by birth, he embodied what many Portuguese desired most: a leader who would fight for their independence. The nation quickly split into two factions. The nobility and wealthy merchants, concerned about their trade relationships with Castile, largely supported Beatrice and her husband. Meanwhile, the lower nobility, common people and burghers of the cities rallied behind John of Aviz. What began as a political dispute erupted into full-blown civil war. The streets of Lisbon witnessed bloody confrontations. The royal chancellor, who supported Castile, was thrown from a tower by an angry mob. The Queen Mother, viewed as a Castilian sympathizer, fled to Santarém. As Castilian forces invaded Portuguese territory, John of Aviz demonstrated remarkable leadership. He organized resistance in Lisbon, secured key fortresses, and reached out to England for support. The English, ever eager to undermine their rival Castile, responded favorably. The tide turned decisively in April 1385, when the Portuguese Cortes, the medieval parliament, convened in Coimbra. After passionate debate and a brilliant legal argument by the jurist João das Regras, who questioned the legitimacy of Beatrice's claim, the Cortes declared João of Aviz the rightful king of Portugal. He was crowned as John I, founding the House of Aviz that would rule Portugal for the next 2 centuries. Here's something fascinating. The English didn't just offer diplomatic support during this crisis. They sent actual military aid for the coming battle at Aljubarrota. English longbowmen, veterans of the 100 Years' War against France, joined the Portuguese forces. These archers, with their deadly yew-bows capable of launching arrows that could pierce armor at 200 yards, would prove absolutely crucial to the Portuguese victory. This military alliance was formalized in the Treaty of Windsor in 1386, creating a bond between Portugal and England that stands as the oldest diplomatic alliance still in force in the world today. Over 600 years later, this alliance continues, a living diplomatic relic that began during this succession crisis. The two nations have come to each other's aid numerous times throughout history, from the Napoleonic Wars to both World Wars, all because of a succession crisis and a battle that was yet to come. As August of 1385 approached, 2 vastly different armies prepared to meet on Portuguese soil. The Castilian force that marched toward Aljubarrota was truly a sight to behold, a massive war machine 30,000 strong that stretched across the horizon like a moving city of steel and flesh. King John of Castile had assembled one of the most formidable armies the Iberian Peninsula had ever seen. The Castilian host wasn't just impressive in numbers. It boasted an elite heavy cavalry, knights in gleaming plate armor mounted on powerful destriers bred specifically for war. These mounted warriors were the medieval equivalent of tanks, nearly invincible when charging in formation. Supporting them were thousands of infantry armed with spears, swords, and crossbows. The Castilian king had even hired French mercenaries, including knights who had fought in the 100 Years' War, bringing their experience and ferocity to bolster his forces. The army's supply train stretched for miles, carrying food, siege equipment, and the personal belongings of noble commanders who traveled with servants and luxuries befitting their status. Confidence radiated through Castilian ranks. How could such overwhelming force possibly fail? Facing this juggernaut was a much smaller Portuguese army, roughly 6,000 men, commanded by the newly crowned King John I and his brilliant constable, Nuno Álvares Pereira. The Portuguese force included men-at-arms, infantry with spears and halberds, crossbowmen, and a contingent of those deadly English longbowmen we mentioned earlier. What they lacked in numbers they made up for in motivation. These men were fighting for their homeland, their independence, and their very identity as Portuguese. Nuno Álvares Pereira, just 25 years old at the time, had already proven himself a military genius in several smaller engagements. Born to a noble family with a strong military tradition, he had dedicated himself to the art of war from an early age. Stories tell of how he would spend hours studying ancient battle accounts and practicing swordplay, developing into one of the finest warriors in Portugal. But his true genius lay in strategy and understanding terrain. And terrain would prove crucial at Aljubarrota. While the Castilians had numbers, the Portuguese had chosen their battlefield with extraordinary care. Nuno had selected a position between 2 small streams on slightly elevated ground with gentle slopes. Hills and valleys surrounded the area, creating natural funnels that would force the much larger Castilian army to compress when attacking. The open field in front appeared inviting to cavalry, but concealed dangers awaited them. The land around Aljubarrota had another advantage. It was familiar territory to the Portuguese defenders, but foreign to the Castilian invaders. Local knowledge would prove invaluable as the battle unfolded. What looked like firm ground might actually be marshy, and what seemed like an easy approach could suddenly narrow into a deadly bottleneck. An interesting detail often overlooked is that the Portuguese soldiers prepared for battle by eating a hearty meal beforehand, while many Castilian troops were hungry after their long march. The Portuguese also traveled light, without the cumbersome supply train that slowed the Castilian advance. This mobility and preparedness gave them yet another edge, despite their numerical disadvantage. As both armies took their positions on that fateful August day, the contrast couldn't have been clearer. A massive, glittering force of professional soldiers against a smaller, more nimble army of determined defenders who knew exactly how to use their chosen ground to maximum advantage. The stage was set for one of history's most remarkable military upsets. In the days before the battle, Nuno Álvares Pereira walked the ground at Aljubarrota repeatedly, studying every slope, every dip, and every rise. What he envisioned would become one of the most brilliant defensive strategies in medieval warfare, a plan that would transform a seemingly impossible situation into one of history's most celebrated victories. Recognizing that Castile's overwhelming numerical advantage and powerful cavalry would crush a traditional battlefield formation, Nuno devised something revolutionary. The night before the battle, under cover of darkness, Portuguese soldiers dug hundreds of concealed pits across the battlefield, hidden traps that would later be dubbed Nuno's holes. Some were deep enough to swallow a horse and rider whole, while others were designed to break legs and create chaos. These pits were then cleverly disguised with light coverings of earth and vegetation, but the traps were just the beginning. Nuno ordered the construction of a network of trenches and earthworks that channeled the attacking forces toward killing zones, where Portuguese crossbowmen and English longbowmen could rain death upon them. Trees were strategically felled to block certain approaches, creating natural barricades that would force the Castilian cavalry to charge along predictable paths, directly into prepared defensive positions. Most ingeniously, Nuno positioned his men in what modern historians call a square of lances, a tightly packed formation of infantry with spears and pikes facing outward in all directions. This human fortress was positioned on slightly elevated ground, giving them both a psychological and tactical advantage. The front ranks knelt with their spear butts anchored in the ground, creating a deadly wall of steel points. Behind them stood additional ranks of soldiers ready to replace any fallen comrades. The English longbowmen, whose involvement in this battle is often overlooked, were strategically placed on the flanks. These archers could release up to 12 arrows per minute, an almost machine gun-like rate of fire for the 14th century. Their yew longbows, standing taller than a man, could penetrate armor at distances of over 200 yards. These English professionals had perfected their craft fighting the French and would prove devastatingly effective against the Castilian knights. What made Nuno's strategy particularly brilliant was its psychological dimension. The battlefield appeared deceptively open and inviting to the Castilians. They could see the much smaller Portuguese force and, confident in their superior numbers, expected a straightforward victory. What they couldn't see were the hidden obstacles and deadly zones of fire that awaited them. A fascinating detail about Nuno's leadership was his personal involvement in preparations. Unlike many medieval commanders who merely gave orders, Nuno worked alongside his men, helping to dig trenches and position defenses. This hands-on approach earned him extraordinary loyalty from his troops, who saw him not just as a brilliant strategist, but as one of their own, a leader who would share in both their labor and their danger. When the Castilians finally attacked, charging forward with absolute confidence, they rode directly into Nuno's perfectly executed trap. Horses tumbled into hidden pits, throwing armored knights to the ground, where they lay helpless as fish out of water. The narrow approach funneled attackers into a concentrated mass, where archers could hardly miss. Those who managed to reach the Portuguese lines were met by that immovable wall of spears and lances, a veritable steel hedgehog that tore apart the Castilian formations. The careful preparation had transformed the battlefield into a deadly maze that negated Castile's advantages and maximized Portugal's defensive capabilities. As one contemporary chronicler wrote, the Castilians charged like lions, but were received by men who stood firm as mountains. Duddy, did you know that the English fought alongside the Portuguese at Aljubarrota? If you're enjoying this video, please like, share and subscribe to the Medieval Archives for more incredible stories from history. And tell us in the comments, do you think Nuno Álvares Pereira's strategy was the decisive factor in Portugal's victory? What other historical battles featured brilliant defensive tactics that overcame overwhelming odds? Dawn broke over Aljubarrota on August 14th, 1385, a day that would forever be etched in the history of Portugal. The summer sun rose slowly, promising scorching heat as it climbed higher in the sky. Birds fell silent as the rumbling of thousands of men and horses reverberated across the landscape. The air was thick with tension, the metallic scent of armor mixing with the earthy smell of churned soil and the nervous sweat of men preparing to face death. King John of Castile had initially planned to bypass the Portuguese position, but pride and confidence in his overwhelming numbers convinced him to accept battle on terms set by the Portuguese. His war council, dominated by French knights eager for glory, pushed for a direct frontal assault. "These Portuguese rebels will break at the first charge," they insisted. This fatal overconfidence would soon be their undoing. Around mid-morning, after a failed negotiation attempt, the Castilian vanguard began to move forward. Their banners and pennants fluttered in the breeze as trumpets sounded the advance. It was an awe-inspiring sight, thousands of men in gleaming armor, their weapons catching the sunlight. Knights on massive war horses formed the spearhead, with infantry and crossbowmen following behind. From the Portuguese position, it must have seemed like an unstoppable human tide of steel and flesh. King John I of Portugal, watching from his position among his men rather than from the safety of the rear, as was customary for monarchs, reportedly turned to his soldiers and said, "My friends, have no fear of their numbers, for today we fight for our kingdom, our families, and our God." A Portuguese chronicler later wrote that the king himself fought on foot alongside his men, refusing special treatment, a detail that endeared him forever to his people. As the Castilian cavalry charged, they suddenly encountered Nuno's carefully prepared battlefield. The ground, which had appeared smooth and perfect for a cavalry charge, was actually a deadly maze. War horses, galloping at full speed, plunged into hidden pits. Knights flew from their saddles, their heavy armor, designed to protect them in combat, now becoming a death trap as they crashed to the earth. Unable to rise quickly in 60 to 70 pounds of steel plate, many were easy targets for Portuguese soldiers, who rushed forward to dispatch the fallen knights. The English longbowmen, positioned on the flanks, began their deadly work. A contemporary account describes the sky darkening with arrows as thousands of shafts rained down on the Castilian forces. The distinctive twang of bowstrings and whistle of arrows filled the air, punctuated by the screams of the wounded and dying. Even the finest Spanish armor couldn't always withstand a direct hit from these powerful weapons. What had begun as an orderly advance quickly descended into chaos. The leading elements of the Castilian army, compressed by the narrowing terrain and stumbling over their own fallen comrades, crashed against the Portuguese square of lances like waves against a cliff. The Portuguese formation held firm, their wall of spears impaling horses and riders alike. A fascinating detail of the battle concerns the flank attack attempted by a Castilian detachment. Having observed the main battle from a distance, a group of Castilian knights attempted to circle around and strike the Portuguese from behind. However, they were intercepted by a reserve force that King John had prudently positioned for just such a contingency. This foresight proved crucial, as a successful flank attack might have unraveled the entire Portuguese defense. By late afternoon, After hours of bloody combat under the merciless summer sun, the Castilian army's will to fight finally broke. What began as individual retreats soon cascaded into a general rout. King John of Castile, seeing his army dissolve around him, fled the field to avoid capture. The Portuguese, exhausted but victorious, were too weary to pursue far, but there was no need. The battle was decisively won. The aftermath was ghastly. Over 2,500 Castilian knights and countless foot soldiers lay dead across the blood-soaked field. The Portuguese losses were remarkably light by comparison, perhaps 100 or 200 men in total. Survivors described the battlefield as a sea of bodies, where one could walk for hundreds of yards, stepping only on the dead and wounded. Among the fallen Castilians were numerous nobles, including the flower of Castilian and French chivalry. So many noble families lost sons in the battle that the day was long remembered in Spain as a national tragedy. The Castilian royal treasury, which had accompanied the army, was captured intact, providing a welcome financial boost to the Portuguese crown. In a touching footnote to the battle, King John of Portugal ordered proper burial for the dead of both sides and treatment for wounded enemies, an unusual act of mercy by medieval standards. He also ordered the construction of the magnificent Batalla Monastery as thanksgiving for the victory, a Gothic masterpiece that still stands today as a monument to this pivotal moment in Portuguese history. The echoes of Aljubarrota's clash of arms have reverberated through the centuries, shaping not just Portugal, but the entire course of European and world history. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, as the dust settled and the dead were buried, few could have imagined just how profound and far-reaching its consequences would be. First and foremost, the victory cemented Portugal's independence. What might have become merely a western province of a greater Castilian kingdom instead remained a sovereign nation with its own distinct identity, language, and destiny. The battle drew a line in the sand, or more accurately in blood, declaring to the world that Portugal would chart its own course. King John I's position on the throne was now unassailable. The new monarch, battle-tested and beloved by his people, founded the House of Aviz, a dynasty that would rule Portugal for the next 2 centuries. Under the Aviz kings, Portugal would experience its golden age, a period of unprecedented exploration, discovery, and empire building that would transform the little kingdom into a global power. One of the most fascinating consequences of Aljubarrota was the marriage that followed. To cement the alliance with England that had proven so crucial in the battle, King John married Philippa of Lancaster, daughter of John of Gaunt and granddaughter of England's King Edward III. This royal union produced a remarkable generation of princes who would lead Portugal into its age of discovery. Their children included Prince Henry the Navigator, who would sponsor the voyages that would push European ships farther down the African coast than ever before, ultimately opening the sea route to India and the spice trade. It's not an exaggeration to say that without Aljubarrota, the age of discovery might have unfolded very differently. Would a Portugal that was merely a province of Castile have launched the ambitious maritime expeditions that changed our understanding of the world? Would the spice trade routes have been pioneered? Would Brazil have been claimed and settled by Portuguese speakers? The battle thus stands as one of those pivotal moments where history balances on a knife's edge, with consequences that ripple across continents and centuries. For Castile, the defeat was catastrophic. Beyond the terrible loss of life, which included many of the kingdom's finest knights and nobles, there was the humiliation of having a vastly superior force routed by a smaller army. King John of Castile fell into a deep depression after the battle, withdrawing from public life and dying just 5 years later, never having recovered from the trauma of the defeat. Castilian military prestige suffered a blow from which it would take generations to recover. The battle's psychological impact on the Portuguese national consciousness cannot be overstated. Aljubarrota became a foundational story in Portuguese identity, a David and Goliath tale that proved Portugal could stand against any odds. Even today, centuries later, Portuguese children learn about the battle in school, and Aljubarrota remains a byword for Portugal's independent spirit and resilience. The magnificent Batalha Monastery, whose construction began in 1388 as King John's thanksgiving for victory, stands as a physical reminder of the battle's significance. This architectural masterpiece, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, combines Gothic and Manueline styles and houses the tombs of King John, Queen Philippa, and their sons. Within its walls, you can still feel the presence of history, a tangible connection to that decisive day in August, almost 6.5 centuries ago. In military history, Aljubarrota is studied as a classic example of how superior tactics, preparation and motivation can overcome overwhelming numerical odds. Nuno Álvares Pereira's innovative defensive strategy has earned him recognition as one of history's great military minds. After the battle, Nuno was made Constable of Portugal and granted vast estates, becoming the most powerful noble in the kingdom. Yet in a surprising twist, he eventually gave up his wealth and titles to become a Carmelite monk, spending his final years in religious contemplation. His remarkable journey from warrior to monk led to his eventual canonization as Saint Nuno in 2009, the only military leader from this era to become a Catholic saint. The Treaty of Windsor, formalized in the battle's aftermath, created an alliance between Portugal and England that incredibly still exists today, the oldest continuous diplomatic alliance in the world. This partnership would prove beneficial to both nations countless times over the centuries, from the Napoleonic Wars to the two world wars of the 20th century. Perhaps the most poignant legacy of Aljubarrota lies in a simple tradition that persisted for centuries in the nearby town of Porto de Mos. Each year on August 14th, the women of the town would ceremonially sweep the road to Aljubarrota, commemorating the legendary baking pan woman, a local baker who, according to folklore, killed 7 Castilian soldiers with her bread peel during the battle's aftermath. This humble tradition, connecting ordinary people to their extraordinary history, reminds us that Aljubarrota wasn't just about kings and knights, but about a nation fighting for its very soul. The Battle of Aljubarrota stands as far more than a mere military victory. It represents a pivotal moment when the course of history turned on the courage, ingenuity, and determination of a small nation that refused to disappear. This remarkable confrontation teaches us that battles aren't always won by the largest army or the wealthiest kingdom. Sometimes the perfect combination of brilliant strategy, intimate knowledge of terrain, unwavering resolve, and fighting for a cause greater than oneself can overcome seemingly impossible odds. The Portuguese triumph at Aljubarrota embodies this timeless lesson. Had the outcome been different, had the Castilian forces prevailed that August day in 1385, our world would look dramatically different today. Portugal might have been absorbed into Spain, becoming just another region rather than an independent kingdom with its own language, culture, and destiny. The great Portuguese navigators might never have set sail under their nation's flag, potentially delaying the age of discovery by decades or altering its course entirely. Brazil, Angola, Mozambique, Goa, Macau, territories across 5 continents that were shaped by Portuguese influence might instead have developed under different colonial powers, or none at all. The first global empire, which connected distant shores and began the process of worldwide trade and cultural exchange, might never have emerged as it did. Even the English-speaking world owes a debt to Aljubarrota. The Anglo-Portuguese alliance that played such a crucial role in the battle would later influence conflicts from the Napoleonic Wars to World War II. The alliance that helped secure Portuguese independence in 1385 would, centuries later, help secure Britain's survival in its darkest hours. In a world increasingly focused on the powerful and the dominant, Aljubarota reminds us that the underdog can prevail. It teaches us that independence and identity are worth fighting for, and that courage and ingenuity can overcome overwhelming force. It demonstrates how a single day of conflict can echo through centuries, shaping the destiny of nations and continents. So what do you think would have happened if the Castilians had won at Aljubarrota? Would Portugal's unique culture and contributions to world history have been lost? Would the age of discovery have unfolded differently? Would the map of the modern world look completely different? History is full of these fascinating what-if moments that invite us to imagine alternative paths humanity might have taken. If you've enjoyed this journey through one of history's most consequential but often overlooked battles, please hit that like button and share this video with friends who appreciate how history shapes our world. Subscribe to the Medieval Archives for more deep dives into the pivotal moments and fascinating characters of the Middle Ages, from legendary battles and brilliant strategies to the cultural developments and human stories that make this era so captivating. Until our next historical adventure, remember that sometimes the smallest nations can change the world, and that understanding our past helps us navigate our future. Thank you for joining us at the Medieval Archives. Until next time.